When Big Shaq found a runaway bride, crying at a lonely bus stop, he thought he was just saving a stranger. But Callie Harrow wasn't running from heartbreak. She was fleeing a ruthless cartel hidden behind American farmland. As secrets crack open and betrayal runs deep, Shaq faces a choice bigger than fame. This time, standing tall might cost him everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The Florida sun blazed mercilessly over the sleepy two-lane highway, the kind that looked as if it had been abandoned by ambition decades ago. Dust hovered just above the cracked asphalt, shimmering under the heat, while wild grass clawed at the broken edges. Shaquille O'Neal, better known to the world as Big Shaq, drove his old navy blue pickup truck, a humble relic he kept despite owning a fleet of luxury cars. Today wasn't about showmanship. It was about peace, or at least it was supposed to be. He was headed to a charity event a few towns over. Nothing fancy, just a small-town fundraiser for a community center gasping for life. Shaq liked these drives, windows down, arm resting on the sill, the world distant, the fame forgotten. But then he saw her. At the desolate bus stop, a woman sat hunched over, her figure crumpled like a discarded paper doll. The white of her dress, or what was left of it, caught the sunlight in sad flashes. Her veil had slipped off, dangling from one elbow, and her bare feet rested on the scalding sidewalk, reddened and raw. The sight slammed into Shaq like a freight train. Without hesitation, he pulled over. Gravel crunched beneath his tires as he eased the truck onto the dirt shoulder. For a moment he simply watched her, trying to piece together the broken stories she wore like armor. Brides weren't supposed to be abandoned under the burning sky, with mascara streaks carving rivers down their cheeks and hands clutched so tightly they trembled. Shaq got out slowly, aware that even in his most casual self, he was a massive, towering figure. Fame made people nervous. His size made it worse. He approached gently, careful not to spook her. She didn't look up. She didn't even flinch. "Miss, you all right?" he asked, voice low and warm, a baseline of pure human concern. No answer. Just the sound of a distant crow and the occasional wheeze of a broken bus stop sign swinging in the breeze. He noticed the suitcase first, battered and torn open at one end, its meager contents spilling into the dust. A few clothes, a cracked photograph frame, and a crushed bouquet of pale pink roses. Shaq knelt beside her, placing himself lower than her line of sight, making himself smaller in every way he could. He didn't need a headline tomorrow, shouting "Shaq intimidates bride at bus stop." He just needed her to feel safe. The locals noticed too. Across the street, a man in a red ball cap leaned against his truck, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. At the diner window, two elderly women stared, lips pressed into judgmental lines. Shaq felt the weight of their suspicion, not just of a strange man approaching a crying woman, but of a black man in their safe little town, daring to involve himself. The stares stung, but he ignored them. The woman mattered more. She finally looked up, eyes swollen and red, mouth trembling like she couldn't quite believe someone had stopped. Her voice cracked when she spoke. "I don't have anywhere to go," she whispered. Shaq offered a soft, encouraging nod. "Hop in. Let's find you somewhere better than this." For a heartbeat she hesitated. Fear flickered across her face, the kind of fear planted deep by betrayal and bruised trust. But then she grabbed the ruined suitcase, clutched it to her chest like a shield, and shuffled toward the truck. The diner ladies shook their heads. The man across the street spat into the dust. The world around them whispered all the wrong things. But Shaq didn't care. He helped her into the passenger seat, the springs groaning under his added bulk, as he climbed back behind the wheel. The inside of the truck smelled like leather and old cologne, a cozy contrast to the blistering heat outside. "I'm Shaq," he said simply, as he pulled back onto the road. She gave him a wary glance. "I know." Her voice was tiny, barely there. They drove in silence for a while. The only sounds the soft whir of the tires and the clink of a rosary swinging from the rearview mirror. Shaq didn't push her to talk. People healed in their own time. A mile or two later, curiosity gently gnawed at him. He ventured carefully. "You hungry?" She nodded, so slight he almost missed it. Shaq turned into the next town's diner, a rickety place with a home-style eat sign swinging above a sun-bleached porch. He chose it for its emptiness. Fewer gawking eyes. As they entered, a bell chimed overhead, and heads swiveled. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a sour smile, greeted Shaq with thinly veiled recognition. The kind that said celebrity was entertainment from afar, not welcome at her tables. They settled into a booth. Shaq ordered pancakes for her, and a coffee for himself. She sat across from him, still clutching her suitcase like it might vanish if she let go. "What's your name?" Shaq asked gently. "Callie," she said after a long pause. "Pretty name," Shaq said, meaning it. A shadow passed across Callie's face. She toyed with the silverware, twisting the fork between her fingers. "You sure you ain't got nobody to call?" he asked, already guessing the answer. She shook her head. "Nobody I want to find me." The pancakes arrived, stacked high, butter melting into golden pools. Callie devoured them with the desperate gratitude of someone who hadn't eaten in too long. Shaq watched, heart aching. Fame had given him mansions, endorsements, applause, but in this booth, none of that mattered. Here, humanity was currency, and the world was bankrupt. As she ate, she began to talk. Pieces, not whole stories. A fiancé who wasn't who he said he was. A wedding she didn't want. An escape through the back doors of a church. Running across fields. Hitchhiking with truckers who wanted too much in return. The more she spoke, the more Shaq realized she wasn't just escaping heartbreak. She was fleeing something more dangerous. Shaq leaned back, absorbing it all. His instincts prickled. He had walked through the world long enough to recognize when fear was about more than just bad luck. As they left the diner, Shaq noticed the same truck with the red ball-cap man parked across the street, engine idling. The man stared at them, stone-faced. Callie stiffened beside him, her whole body screaming tension. Shaq led her back to the truck, masking his unease with casual confidence. As they pulled onto the highway again, he caught a glimpse of the red ball-cap truck pulling out behind them, keeping pace at a distance. Trouble was brewing, no doubt about it. But Shaq didn't flinch. His grip on the wheel tightened, knuckles whitening. "I got you," he said under his breath. More to himself than to her. The fields rolled past, golden and empty. The world wide and watching. Somewhere ahead, Shaq knew, they'd have to find shelter, safety, and answers. But for now, all he could do was drive, and pray that his heart would be enough to outrun the gathering storm. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across the road like grasping fingers. In the rearview mirror, the truck still followed. And so the journey began. Big Shaq, a broken bride, and a trail of invisible enemies stitching themselves into the seams of the horizon. "You good?" he asked finally, his voice low and steady, like a lighthouse beam cutting through a fog. Callie nodded sharply, but it wasn't conviction in her movements. It was instinct. The kind of automatic response people gave when they didn't dare tell the truth. "Where you headed?" Shaq asked, feigning casual curiosity. "South," Callie said quickly, too quickly. "Got a cousin down there." Shaq caught it, the barest hesitation, the stumble she almost made. A cousin? Maybe. Or maybe not. He didn't call her out. Instead, he adjusted his grip on the wheel and kept driving, offering her the precious illusion of trust. The highway narrowed, giving way to a cluster of aging gas stations and motels with flickering neon signs. Shaq's truck was guzzling fuel, and he knew they wouldn't get much farther without stopping. He pulled into a station on the edge of town, the kind where the pumps looked as old as the asphalt they stood on. "Stretch your legs," Shaq said as he killed the engine. "I'll fill up." Callie hesitated, scanning the surroundings with wide darting eyes. Only when she was sure no immediate threats loomed did she slide out of the truck, clutching her suitcase to her side like a lifeline. Shaq swiped his card at the pump, the machine beeping sluggishly. As he filled the tank, he kept Callie in his peripheral vision. She wandered a few steps toward the dusty vending machines, glancing over the snack options, but not reaching for anything. Her body remained coiled, like a deer expecting the snap of a hunter's rifle. Then Shaq saw it. Across the lot, parked behind a grimy station wagon, a black sedan sat idle, its windows tinted darker than the law usually allowed. A man leaned against the driver's side door, pretending to scroll through his phone, but it was the angle of his body, the way he kept glancing over the screen at Callie, that set Shaq's instincts roaring to life. He didn't react outwardly. He simply finished pumping gas, replaced the nozzle, and called out to Callie in a tone as normal as sunshine. "You want something to eat before we roll?" Callie turned, forcing a brittle smile. "No, I'm okay." Shaq didn't miss the tremble in her hands, the way her suitcase strap slipped and she fumbled it back onto her shoulder. He rounded the truck casually, moving slow and easy, but inside his mind raced. The man by the sedan straightened slightly, like a shark scenting blood. Shaq opened the passenger door, gesturing for Callie to get in. She obeyed without hesitation, sliding into the seat and snapping the buckle home. Shaq got behind the wheel, started the engine, and pulled out of the gas station with deliberate calm. In the rearview mirror, he watched the black sedan ease out too, slipping onto the road behind them, at a distance that screamed practiced surveillance. For a few miles, Shaq said nothing. He let the truck eat the distance between them and the station, let the silence thicken into something real. Then, when the cornfield swallowed the view of town behind them, "You want to tell me the real story, Callie?" She flinched, her hands twisting in her lap. For a moment, it seemed she might bolt from the moving vehicle itself. "I can't," she said finally, voice cracking. "It's not safe." Shaq's gaze flicked to the rear view. The sedan was still there, a dark stain on the bright day. "Not safe like running barefoot in a wedding dress down back roads?" he asked, not unkindly. Her shoulders sagged. The bravado melted away, leaving a woman made of pure trembling exhaustion. "They'll hurt me," she whispered. "Who's they?" Callie swallowed hard. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her jaw set with sudden steel. "People who don't let go easy. People who make promises and punish you when you don't keep them." Shaq let her words settle in the air between them. He didn't push harder. Trust wasn't built with demand. "You're safe with me," he said simply. She gave a bitter laugh, a sound that clawed at Shaq's heart. "No one's safe. Not really. Not from them." Ahead, a turnoff appeared, leading into an even narrower road fringed with wild trees and dense brush. Shaq made a snap decision, flicking the blinker and steering onto the side road. The black sedan followed, but more cautiously now, hanging back farther. The woods closed around them, muting the sun into dappled gold and shadow. Shaq slowed slightly, scanning the roadside until he found what he was looking for, a break in the brush wide enough for his truck to slip through. He swung off the road, tires crunching over dead leaves, and cut the engine. He turned to Callie. Her face was pale, her eyes huge. "We wait," Shaq said, voice a low rumble. "See if they bite." Minutes dragged by, thick and heavy. The woods hummed with the sound of cicadas, and somewhere far off, a crow caught a single hollow note. In the distance, the black sedan crept past, moving slow, searching. Callie sagged against the seat, a broken marionette. Shaq kept his eyes on the sliver of road he could see through the trees. Muscles coiled, every sense alert. The sedan disappeared from view, swallowed by the bend in the road. Shaq waited another 10 minutes before restarting the engine and easing back onto the pavement. This time, they headed west, not south, abandoning the trail the pursuers expected them to follow. Callie finally spoke, her voice so small. Shaq almost didn't catch it. "I wasn't supposed to marry him," she said. "I was supposed to help bring two families together. Business, not love." Shaq kept his face neutral, even as anger kindled low in his gut. "When I said no, they said I owed them. They said I'd pay either way." "Families?" Shaq echoed carefully. She nodded. "Big money. Old names. The kind you don't cross without consequences." Shaq exhaled slowly. He knew that world. Maybe not in the same way, but he'd seen the rot underneath the glitzy surface enough times to recognize the stench of control and greed when it crept into the air. "You're doing the right thing," he said. Callie turned to him, a desperate hope flickering in her tired eyes. "You don't even know me." Shaq smiled. A soft, sad thing. "Don't need to. I know right from wrong." The road opened up again, the trees falling away to wide, open fields. Shaq spotted a battered sign for a roadside inn up ahead. Low rates, privacy, the kind of place no one asked questions. He glanced at Callie. She needed rest. A chance to gather herself before whatever came next. "We'll hole up for the night," Shaq said. "Figure out a plan in the morning." Callie didn't argue. She simply leaned her forehead against the window, eyes fluttering shut, exhaustion finally overtaking her terror. Shaq drove on, the sun setting behind them in a blaze of orange fire. Somewhere, out there in the gathering dark, predators circled. But in this moment, in this fragile, fleeting peace, hope stirred. The night would be long. The dangers would be real. But Shaq was ready. Because sometimes giants weren't made on basketball courts. Sometimes they were forged on broken roads, cradling broken people, and standing tall against the shadows. And Big Shaq wasn't about to let the darkness win. The battered sign for Nolan Farms leaned precariously on one rusted post, barely clinging to the last vestiges of paint that named the place. Shaq turned the truck onto a dirt path that kicked up a cloud of dust thick enough to choke out the setting sun. The road wound through dry fields and abandoned equipment until it broke into a clearing where a sagging farmhouse stood like a battered prizefighter, worn but not yet defeated. Callie stirred from her uneasy doze, blinking against the grime-streaked window. Her face reflected a tangle of exhaustion and wary hope. Shaq said nothing as he parked the truck near the porch, engine rumbling to a stop with a final shudder. His gut churned with unease, but options were dwindling fast, and the night was closing in. The screen door creaked open before Shaq's foot hit the ground. A wiry man in faded overalls and a sun-bleached cap emerged, wiping his hands on a grimy rag. His face, though carved with deep lines and suspicion, carried the rough pride of a man who refused to be crushed by time or circumstance. Jed Nolan, he introduced himself, voice rough as gravel. His eyes flicked to Callie, lingering a fraction too long on her disheveled appearance before snapping back to Shaq with calculated wariness. "What brings a big man like you out here this time of day?" Shaq held his ground, letting the silence stretch just enough to establish respect. "Need a place for the night. Just until morning. We'll pay." Jed's gaze sharpened. In these parts, payment spoke louder than questions. He jerked his chin toward the house. "Ain't the Ritz, but it's dry. Got a spare room over the barn." Shaq nodded. "That'll do." Callie slid out of the truck, pulling her suitcase tight against her side. Jed's eyes followed her with a weight that made Shaq's hackles rise. Not malicious exactly, but measuring calculating risk versus reward. They followed Jed across the packed dirt yard, passing a rusted tractor that looked like it hadn't roared to life in years. A few chickens scratched half-heartedly at the dry ground, and a tired dog lifted its head from the porch, gave a low, suspicious growl, then flopped back down, unconcerned. The barn loomed ahead, its red paint faded to a weary pink, the massive doors hanging slightly ajar. Jed led them up a rickety staircase on the side, each step groaning under Shaq's weight. At the top, he pushed open a door to a small loft. A cot, a battered dresser, and a cracked mirror filled the space. Dust motes danced in the slanting beams of dying sunlight. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. "You'll be fine up here," Jed said. "Ain't nobody comes round this time of night." His tone said more than his words. Shaq nodded once, reading the undercurrents. There was a warning hidden in Jed's casual stance, a tension humming in the stale barn air. "Thank you," Shaq said simply. Jed gave a curt nod and turned to leave, pausing only to add, "Lock the door. Folks round here don't take kindly to strangers." When the door creaked shut behind him, Callie let out a shuddering breath and sagged onto the cot, the suitcase sliding from her grasp. Shaq moved to the small window overlooking the fields, scanning the horizon. The black sedan hadn't followed them this far, at least not yet, but instincts sharpened by years of navigating fame's more dangerous edges told him they weren't safe. Night fell quickly, cloaking the farm in heavy darkness. Shaq found an old oil lamp and lit it, the flames sputtering before settling into a feeble glow. In its soft light, Callie looked even smaller, her thin shoulders bowed under the weight of invisible burdens. "You trust him?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Shaq shrugged. "Trust's a strong word. Want us time. That's enough for now." Downstairs, the faint clatter of dishes and the muted murmur of a radio floated up through the floorboards. The normalcy was jarring, a stark contrast to the jagged fear threading through every breath they took. Shaq stayed by the window, watching, waiting. He didn't miss the subtle movements on the edge of the property. A figure shifting between the cornstalks, the glint of something metallic under the moonlight. His stomach tightened, but he kept his face calm, no sense in alarming Callie until he had to. Hours passed. Callie eventually drifted into a restless sleep, whimpering under her breath. Shaq remained a silent sentinel by the window, muscles coiled, mind churning. Sometime after midnight, a soft knock rattled the door. 3 quick raps, deliberate. Shaq rose silently, crossing to the door and pressing his ear against it. "Shaq?" Jed's rough voice called low. "Need a word." Shaq opened the door a crack. Jed's face was pinched, his mouth a grim line. "You need to come with me," Jed said. "Something you ought to see." Shaq hesitated only a moment before stepping out, pulling the door shut behind him. Jed led him down the stairs and across the yard, the old dog trailing lazily behind them. They stopped near the tool shed, where Jed pointed toward the fields. In the distance, faint against the darkness, headlights blinked once, twice, then vanished. "Been out there an hour," Jed muttered. "Ain't local boys. Locals ain't that patient." Shaq's jaw tightened. "You know who they are?" Jed shrugged. "Don't ask questions I don't want answers to. But they ain't here for chickens." The air between them thickened with unspoken truths. Jed lit a cigarette with trembling fingers, the orange tip flaring bright. "I ain't stupid," Jed said. "Girl like that, she's got trouble stitched into her shadow." Shaq crossed his arms over his chest. "You gonna turn us in?" Jed took a long drag, exhaling smoke into the night. His gaze was hard when it met Shaq's. "Not yet." Shaq read the subtext clear. Loyalty here was a currency, and it was expensive. "You need money, Jed?" Shaq asked quietly. Jed's laugh was hollow. "Hell, we all need money. But some debts don't take cash." Shaq held his stare. "We leave at first light." Jed nodded. "Best you do. Sooner the better." Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Shaq alone with the gnawing realization that every second they lingered made them more vulnerable. Back in the loft, Callie sat awake, knees drawn to her chest. "Something's wrong," she said before Shaq could speak. "Yeah," he admitted. "We need to move at dawn." She nodded, her face pale but resolute. Neither of them slept for the remainder of the night. When the first fragile fingers of dawn crept over the fields, Shaq and Callie were ready. They moved quietly, carrying only what they needed. As they descended the stairs, Shaq caught movement out of the corner of his eye. Jed standing by the porch, watching them go. No words passed between them, just a grim nod that said everything. Shaq loaded Callie into the truck and fired up the engine, the rumble shattering the fragile morning peace. He pulled onto the dirt road, tires spinning briefly before gripping. As they drove away, Shaq cast one last glance in the mirror. At the edge of the cornfield, 3 dark figures emerged, too late to stop them. But Shaq knew they weren't done. The farm had its secrets, and the whispers of betrayal still clung to the morning air. The real chase was only just beginning. "Callie, there you are," he said, voice warm enough to curdle milk. "We've been worried sick." The shorter one, with a narrow face and cold blue eyes, leaned in. "Your family sent us. You're safe now." Callie shrank against the window, her body pressing so tightly into the glass that Shaq feared she might shatter. Her knuckles turned white around the edge of the table. Shaq's massive frame shifted forward, blocking her from their view without even thinking about it. "Family?" he asked, voice low, dangerous without raising a decibel. The blonde one's smile widened. "We represent her father's interests." Shaq said nothing, simply stared. Years of media training and courtroom depositions had taught him that silence could rattle even the most confident liars. The blonde one faltered slightly under Shaq's unblinking gaze, but recovered quickly. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his inner pocket and slid it across the table. "A legal document," he said. "Her guardianship reverts back to her father, unless she marries by the end of the month. We're just here to escort her home." Callie's breath hitched audibly. Shaq didn't touch the paper. "You got ID?" he asked. The blonde man's smile thinned. "Not necessary." Shaq leaned closer, letting his size do the talking. "It is to me." For a flicker of a second, something ugly crawled across the man's polished features. The shorter one stiffened, his hand twitching toward his jacket in a way that screamed concealed weapon, without making the mistake of drawing it. Shaq didn't move. He didn't need to. His presence alone filled the booth, the diner, the entire damn parking lot. He stared them down like he'd stared down 7-foot opponents in the final seconds of championship games. Callie found her voice. Small but razor-edged. "I'm not going with you." The blonde man's eyes glittered. "Callie, don't be foolish. You have obligations." Shaq cut in before she could falter. She said no. The two men exchanged a look, a silent conversation laced with frustration and calculation. "You're interfering in family business," the narrow-faced man said quietly. "That's a mistake." Shaq's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Then you better hope I keep making mistakes." The blonde man stood abruptly, smoothing his suit jacket as if shedding invisible dust. His partner followed suit, but not before leaning down close enough for only Shaq to hear. "You're standing between powerful people and what they want," he hissed. "That's never smart." Shaq didn't blink. Neither is underestimating the wrong man. The men left without another word, the door's bell jangling behind them like a starting gun, for the danger now racing toward them. Callie sagged against the booth, her entire body trembling. Shaq remained still, scanning the diner for watching eyes, listening for the rumble of returning engines. "You all right?" he asked finally. She nodded weakly, but tears glistened in her eyes. "I can't go back," she whispered. "They'll ruin me." Shaq's heart twisted. "You won't have to." Outside, the black sedan idled by the curb. The two men inside, watching. Shaq reached into his pocket, sliding a few crumpled bills onto the table. "Time to move," he said. They exited the diner slowly, deliberately, refusing to show the fear gnawing at their insides. The sun had climbed high overhead, baking the world in merciless heat. Shaq steered Callie toward the truck, every muscle in his body taut with readiness. He felt the men's eyes burning holes into his back, felt the electric thrum of threats left unspoken. As he pulled onto the highway, tires spitting gravel, Shaq caught the glint of something taped under the sedan's front bumper. A GPS tracker, blinking like a heartbeat. They weren't just following. They were hunting. The realization settled heavy in his chest. This was bigger than an angry family or a botched wedding. This was machinery, gears grinding to crush anything in their way. Callie wasn't just running from heartbreak. She was running from a machine that consumed people whole. And now Shaq was standing right in its path. He glanced at Callie, who sat stiffly, her hands fisted in her lap. "You trust me?" he asked. She met his eyes, raw and scared, and fierce. "I have to." Shaq smiled grimly. "Good, 'cause we're gonna need a hell of a miracle." The afternoon sun blazed like judgment as they sped toward the unknown, shadows gathering at high noon, and the past riding hard on their heels. The landscape blurred past the truck's windows, a patchwork quilt of dusty fields, sagging barns, and crumbling fences. Shaq's mind raced faster than the wheels beneath them, turning over everything he'd seen, everything he'd heard. Callie sat beside him, hugging herself, her body language broadcasting a silent scream. She looked smaller than ever, and for the first time, Shaq realized that the weight pressing on her shoulders was far heavier than fear alone. It was guilt, shame, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. They needed answers. They needed them fast. Trusting strangers wasn't going to save them this time. Shaq veered onto a less traveled side road, a ribbon of cracked asphalt that led into the skeletal remains of a forgotten town. The only sign of life was an old payphone, astonishingly still standing outside a boarded-up convenience store. He pulled to a stop, cut the engine, and turned to Callie. "You stay here. Keep the doors locked." Her protest was silent, her nod almost invisible. Shaq stepped into the oppressive heat and made his way to the phone. He fed it quarters, listening to the clink of each coin like the ticking of a bomb. When the line connected, he dialed a number he hadn't used in years. A journalist friend from his college days, someone who still believed in digging up buried truth. The call connected on the third ring. "Mitchell," came the familiar, weary voice. "It's Shaq." A pause, sharp and crackling. "Shaq? Man, it's been a minute. What's this about?" "I need a deep dive. Quiet. Quick. Name's Callie Harrow. Find out who she's connected to." Mitchell whistled low. "That's rural royalty. Harrow family's got their claws in half the state. Big agriculture, land deals, heavy donors to all the wrong campaigns. You sure you want to poke that hornet's nest?" Shaq's voice dropped an octave. "Already did. Now I need to know how bad it stings." Mitchell promised to call back within the hour. Shaq hung up and returned to the truck, settling in to wait with the unease of a man who knew the storm was already gathering. Callie twisted her fingers in her lap, her knuckles white. "Who was that?" she asked. "Somebody who can get us the truth," Shaq said. "Real truth." The minutes dragged, sticky and slow. Finally, the payphone rang, startling them both. Shaq jumped out and grabbed it on the second ring. "Got your dirt," Mitchell said, his voice grim. "And it's ugly." Shaq listened without interrupting, his stomach sinking with every word. The Harrow family wasn't just wealthy landowners. They were the cornerstone of a sprawling cartel operating under the mask of respectable business land, agriculture, construction. They laundered money through marriages of convenience, binding families together in a corrupt web of power consolidation. Young women, including daughters and nieces, were bartered like commodities to seal land deals and political favors. Resistance wasn't tolerated. Those who rebelled were discredited, disinherited, or worse, quietly erased. Callie, Mitchell said, had been promised to the son of a rival family, a union meant to solidify control over a critical stretch of farmland needed for a new development scam. When she refused at the last minute, she hadn't just embarrassed her family. She had threatened their entire operation. They're not just trying to bring her back, Shaq, Mitchell said. They're trying to erase the problem she became. Shaq's hand clenched around the receiver so tightly he thought it might snap. His voice was a low growl. You bet my career on it, Mitchell said grimly. They're dirty, Shaq. Old money dirty. Racism baked into their bones dirty. And they got friends in law enforcement. Politics, you name it. You're playing a dangerous game. Shaq hung up without a word and returned to the truck, the weight of the information a stone in his chest. He slid behind the wheel, staring out at the empty road ahead. You were right, he said, his voice rough. It's worse than you thought. Callie stared at him, fear bleeding into hopelessness. They'll never let me go. Shaq shook his head. They're not going to get the chance. He started the engine, turning the truck toward the horizon. Running wasn't enough anymore. They needed to expose the truth. They needed leverage, something big enough to shatter the Harrow family's stranglehold. But first, they needed sanctuary. Shaq drove for hours, leaving the crumbling town behind, crossing into a rougher, poorer county, where the Harrow name didn't carry as much weight. They stopped at a tiny roadside motel, the kind that rented rooms by the week, no questions asked. The manager barely glanced at them, handing over a key with a grunt. Shaq paid cash. Inside the room, the air was stale, the carpet worn thin, but it was private. Safe, for now. Callie sat on the edge of the bed, her suitcase still clutched like a lifeline. You ever think you'd end up here? Shaq asked gently. She gave a bitter smile. Not even in my worst nightmare. Shaq lowered himself into the only chair, the wood creaking under his weight. You want to tell me everything? He asked. Start to finish? Callie hesitated, then nodded. My family, she began, voice shaking. It was always about power, control. Marriages weren't about love. They were business deals. My older sisters, her voice broke. They didn't fight. They just disappeared inside it. She looked up at Shaq, her eyes burning. I tried to be the good daughter. I tried to do what they wanted, until I met him. Shaq's brows lifted. The man they wanted me to marry. Bennett Cross. On the surface he's handsome, charming. But underneath, she shivered. Cruel, cold, like a hammer waiting to fall. I saw what he did to others, people who crossed him. When I realized I was next, I ran. She wiped her eyes, furious at her own tears. I didn't think they'd come after me this hard. I thought, maybe they'd just let me go, that I wasn't worth the trouble. Shaq leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You're worth a hell of a lot more than any deal, he said. Callie laughed brokenly. Not to them. Shaq's mind turned over the pieces. Forced marriages, land grabs, corrupt officials. All hidden behind the respectable facade of small-town values and family pride. It was racism in a new uniform. Still about control. Still about dehumanizing anyone who didn't fit the mold. And now Callie was a loose thread that threatened to unravel it all. We need evidence, Shaq said. Proof of what they're doing. Something they can't bury. Callie nodded slowly. I know where they keep it. My father has a ledger. Names, dates, deals, blackmail material. It's locked up at the estate. Shaq's heart sank. Infiltrating the Harrow estate would be suicide. Armed guards, surveillance, family loyalists willing to lie, cheat, and frame anyone who got too close. But without that ledger, they were just two voices shouting into a hurricane. You think you can get us in? Shaq asked. Callie chewed her lip, thinking. There's an old service road, barely used anymore, and a hidden entrance through the greenhouse. My mother showed me once. Before her voice trailed off, pain flashing across her face. Shaq didn't push. Then that's our way, he said. The plan began to form, rough but possible. Slip in under cover of darkness. Get the ledger. Get out before anyone knew they were there. Simple. Dangerous. Necessary. Callie looked at him, fear and hope warring in her eyes. You don't have to do this, she whispered. Shaq gave a slow, crooked smile. Yeah, I do. Because Callie wasn't the first person crushed under the boot of power and prejudice. And if Shaq had a chance, even a slim one, to crack that boot, he was damn sure gonna take it. The sun dipped below the horizon, dragging shadows across the cracked pavement outside. Tomorrow the real fight would begin, and Shaq was ready to step into the storm. "No time," Shaq barked. "Hold on." He gummed the engine, spinning the truck around, just as the first black SUV skidded into the yard. Men in suits spilled out, moving fast, boxing them in. Shaq's brain raced through options. Fight wasn't possible. Flight was barely on the table. He needed an opening. Anything. Jed stepped forward, hands raised, moving deliberately toward the men. Shaq watched in the mirror, heart pounding. Jed's voice carried across the yard, rough and defiant. "Deal's off," he shouted. "Ain't no girl here. You got lied to." The men hesitated, uncertain. Their eyes flicked toward the truck. Shaq seized the moment. He slammed his foot down, the truck lurching forward. Gravel exploded under the tires as he swung wide, dodging between two vehicles. Gunmetal glinted in the sun as one of the men reached under his jacket, but another more senior, colder, held him back with a single sharp gesture.
"No physical violence. Not here. Not yet."
They needed her alive. At least for now. Shaq sped down the dirt road, heart hammering. Callie crouched low in the seat. Behind them, chaos exploded. Shouts, engines revving, men scrambling to give chase. Jed stood his ground as two of the men grabbed him, shoving him roughly against a SUV hood. Even from a distance, Shaq could see Jed's lips move in a single defiant curse. Shaq tightened his grip on the wheel. Jed's betrayal had nearly cost them everything, but in the end, he'd chosen his side. Maybe too late, maybe just in time. The chase stretched into the open fields, the truck rattling over uneven ground. Shaq trusted the land more than he trusted the roads. He veered off the path, sending the truck bouncing through dry cornfields, tall stalks whipping against the windows. The black SUVs followed, struggling to maintain speed without losing control. Callie clung to the dashboard, her face a mask of terror and disbelief. "I thought he sold us out," she cried. "He did," Shaq growled. "But even broken men can choose right when it matters." The truck skidded around a battered irrigation ditch. One of the SUVs hit it wrong, and fishtailed, slamming into a stand of trees. Shaq didn't slow down. He pushed the truck harder, the engine howling in protest. Minutes later, they burst through a stand of trees and found themselves on another narrow back road, cutting sharply toward the south. Shaq finally let up on the gas, breathing hard. For now, they had lost them, but he knew it wouldn't last. Callie stared at him, her lip trembling. "We're running out of places to hide," she whispered. Shaq reached over and squeezed her hand gently, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his gut. "Then we stop hiding." The plan hadn't changed. Get the ledger. Expose the Harrows. Burn the whole corrupt system to the ground. Jed Nolan's betrayal had cost them precious time, but it had also taught Shaq a brutal truth. The enemy wasn't just the men chasing them. It was fear. It was silence. It was the temptation to look the other way for an easy paycheck. And if Jed, broken and bitter as he was, could find the courage to stand up at the last second, then Shaq could damn well find a way to finish this fight. Night crept across the horizon, the fields turning to black oceans under a blood-red sky. Shaq pressed the pedal down, the truck roaring into the darkness. The farm was behind them. The reckoning lay ahead. And this time, there would be no turning back. The sun had barely begun its slow climb over the distant hills when Shaq turned the battered truck off the main road and onto a path even rougher than the ones they'd fled. Callie shifted uneasily beside him, her fingers clenching the seat as the tires jostled over rocks and broken ground. In the distance, low buildings sagged against the horizon, a worn collection of shacks and barns where the paint had long surrendered to the elements. It didn't look like salvation. It barely looked like shelter. But Shaq wasn't banking on appearances anymore. This was Hardwell Farms, a forgotten corner of the county where laborers worked sunup to sundown, invisible to the world that fattened itself on their sweat. It was a place where names didn't matter, and the rules bent to the weight of need, and it was here that Shaq hoped to find something stronger than money or power: solidarity. He pulled up near a row of rusted equipment sheds and killed the engine. Dust swirled around them, catching the early morning light like fine gold. A handful of figures paused from their tasks to watch them approach, their faces wary but not unfriendly. Shaq recognized the look. It was the gaze of people who had seen too much, trusted too little, and survived anyway. Callie glanced at him, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "Will they help us?" she asked. Shaq smiled grimly. "They'll listen. That's all we need to start. He stepped out of the truck, lifting his hands in an easy, non-threatening gesture. The nearest worker, a stocky woman with a faded bandana tied around her hair, set down her tools and walked over. Her stance was cautious, but curious. "You're a long way from town, big man," she said, voice roughened by years under the sun. Shaq offered a nod. "Name's Shaq. This is Callie. We need help." The woman squinted at him, then at Callie, taking in her torn dress and haunted eyes. "Help with what?" Shaq took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "Callie's running from people who think they own her. Rich folks. Dangerous folks. They're hunting her because she said no to a life they tried to force on her." Murmurs rippled through the gathered workers, a current of recognition passing from face to face. They knew the story. Maybe not the specifics, but the song was the same, different verses of the same old injustice. "We don't want no trouble," another voice called out, this time from an older man, leaning heavily on a shovel. Shaq didn't flinch. "Neither do we. We're not here to fight. We're here to outthink them." He saw it then. The slight lift of shoulders, the tilting of heads, curiosity, hope, the faintest spark of defiance. The woman studied Shaq a moment longer before sticking out her hand. "Name's Ruthie. You got guts coming here. Might be we got a few left ourselves." Shaq shook her hand, feeling the calluses of hard labor under her grip. He nodded once. "Then let's get to work." In the shade of a collapsing barn, Shaq laid out the plan. It had to be smart, quick, invisible. No violence, no heroics. Just a community willing to stand taller than the fear that had kept them bowed for too long. First, they'd scatter false trails. Old trucks would make decoy runs up and down the nearby highways, loaded with mannequins dressed to resemble Callie. Meanwhile, Callie herself would vanish into the folds of the farm, hidden among the very people her pursuers would least expect. The overlooked, the invisible, the forgotten. They moved fast. Ruthie and the others raided thrift stores for clothes. An old battered hat concealed Callie's distinctive hair. Dirt and sweat transformed her from runaway bride to anonymous laborer. Her fancy dress was traded for worn jeans and a stained flannel shirt, 2 sizes too big. Shaq watched it happen, marveling at the quiet efficiency of people who had spent their lives adapting to survive. He saw how they passed along instructions in murmurs and nods, how they blended their movements into the background noise of the farm. By the time the black SUVs rolled into view late that afternoon, the trap was already set. Shaq stood near the gate, arms crossed, expression blank. Ruthie leaned against a fence post nearby, chewing a piece of straw, looking every inch the disinterested worker. 3 men climbed out of the vehicles, sharp-eyed and sharper dressed, the same polished danger Shaq had seen before. Their leader, a wiry man with silver hair and a snake's smile, approached. "We're looking for a girl," he said without preamble. "You seen anyone new around here?" Shaq shrugged, all casual indifference. "Lots of girls come through. You got a name?" The silver-haired man's smile didn't waver. "Callie Harrow." Shaq spat into the dust, playing the role perfectly. "Never heard of her." The man's eyes narrowed. He scanned the workers moving through the fields, saw nothing but brown skin, sunburned faces, and stooped shoulders. Just another day at a dying farm. Just another mass of nobodies. Shaq could see the moment doubt crept in. These men weren't used to searching through the invisible layers of America. They weren't used to laborers looking them dead in the eye without flinching. "You sure about that?" the man pressed. Shaq gave him a slow, deliberate smile. "You want to go check the fields? Be my guest. But you best be ready to explain to a lot of folks why you're messing with farmhands just trying to put food on their tables." It wasn't a threat. It was a truth. The kind of truth that didn't need fists to make itself heard. The man hesitated. He looked around again, saw nothing but hard work and harder faces. And for the first time, Shaq saw uncertainty crack through the polished armor. The silent uprising wasn't banners and marches. It was a wall of people refusing to look away, refusing to bow, refusing to be less than seen. After a long, tense moment, the silver-haired man nodded sharply to his crew. Without another word, they climbed back into their SUVs and pulled away, engines snarling in frustration. As the dust settled, a collective breath whooshed from the gathered workers. Ruthie grinned, tossing her straw aside. "Guess they don't know what to do when the nobodies don't act like nobodies." Shaq laughed, a deep rumbling sound that felt like thunder after a drought. Callie emerged from the shadows, her disguise still in place, tears glistening in her eyes. "You saved me," she whispered. Ruthie shook her head. "Nah, girl. You saved yourself. We just helped you remember you ain't alone." Later that night, they gathered around a makeshift fire pit, the stars overhead so thick they seemed to crowd each other for space. Ruthie passed around mugs of bitter coffee, and the stories began to flow. Quiet, unpolished confessions of lost homes, broken promises, stolen futures. Callie listened, her heart breaking, and healing in equal measure. She saw herself reflected in every line of hardship, every crack of bitter laughter. These weren't people who needed rescuing. These were warriors who had learned to survive battles no one else even noticed. Shaq leaned back against a battered truck, sipping his coffee, watching the firelight dance across Callie's face.
"You ready for the next step?" he asked.
She met his gaze, and for the first time there was no fear in her eyes. Only determination. "Yeah," she said. "I'm ready." Tomorrow they would go after the ledger. Tomorrow they would expose the truth. Tonight they had found something rarer than safety. They had found a family. The silent uprising had begun, not with a roar but with the steady, unstoppable heartbeat of 100 invisible souls refusing to be unseen. And Big Shaq, the giant who never stopped believing in people, was right there with them. Shaq cursed under his breath. They had been faster than expected. Maybe someone tipped them off. Again. Maybe there was no such thing as a clean getaway when you were up against men who had built empires on fear. He floored the gas. The truck lurched forward with a roar, the tires spitting gravel in every direction. The SUVs reacted instantly, engines growling like wolves, scenting blood. Ruthie leaned out the window, shouting directions. "Left. Take the creek bed." Shaq obeyed without hesitation, wrenching the wheel. The truck bucked and bounced over the uneven ground, plunging down a narrow path where grass grew knee-high, and the trees formed dark, grasping tunnels. Behind them, the SUVs gave chase, their beams slicing through the night. The decoy vehicle swung into motion, engines coughing and rattling, as they peeled off in different directions. For a moment, confusion reigned. The SUVs hesitated, some veering after the decoys, others staying locked onto Shaq's truck. Shaq gritted his teeth and pushed harder. Every jolt, every shudder threatened to expose Callie, hidden and vulnerable. He couldn't think about what would happen if they caught up. He could only drive. A narrow bridge loomed ahead, its boards ancient and sagging. Beyond it, freedom, or at least more space to hide. "Hold tight," Shaq shouted. The truck hit the bridge with a bone-jarring crash. Wood splintered beneath them, the whole structure groaning like it might tear itself apart. But they made it across, the bridge collapsing in a cloud of debris, as the first SUV tried to follow and plunged nose first into the ravine. Ruthie whooped, a wild sound of defiance. But the victory was short-lived. From a hidden side road, a third SUV roared into view. Headlights blinding. "They're boxing us in," Ruthie shouted. Shaq's mind raced. The farm's old orchard was just ahead, dense, overgrown, full of twisted trees that no car could easily navigate. It was their only chance. He yanked the wheel hard, sending the truck careening off the main path and into the orchard. Branches scraped and clawed at the sides, the tires slipping and sliding over rotting fruit and thick mud. Behind them, the SUV hesitated. It was too big, too clean, too precious to risk the orchard's brutal embrace. For a heartbeat, hope flared. Then betrayal reared its head once more. Another farmhand, a wiry, bitter man named Doyle, who had kept mostly to himself, stepped into the clearing ahead. His face was twisted with fear and greed. His hand waved frantically at the SUVs behind them, signaling their location. Shaq felt the betrayal like a knife between the ribs. "They paid him," Ruthie spat. Fury etched across her face. There was no time to rage, no time to mourn, only time to act. Shaq jerked the wheel again, plunging deeper into the orchard. The truck bucked and screamed in protest. A branch smashed the side mirror. Mud flew in thick, wet clumps. Behind them, the SUVs found another way in, slower but relentless. The truck's engine coughed, then roared, a dying beast refusing to quit. Shaq spotted an old drainage culvert ahead, barely wide enough for the truck, but offering a chance to slip away unseen. "Hang on!" he roared. He aimed for the culvert, tires churning, the truck's frame groaning under the strain. They hit it at a brutal angle, the impact slamming them against their seats. The tarp shifted dangerously, but Callie held on. The truck scraped through, emerging onto a narrow, overgrown trail that twisted back toward the main road. A road the SUVs had bypassed in their arrogance. Shaq pressed the gas to the floor. The battered vehicle hurtled forward, a runaway comet in the night. Behind them, the SUVs were forced to backtrack, trapped by their own size and speed. They broke free of the orchard's shadows just as dawn cracked the horizon, in a thin line of silver and pink. Shaq didn't stop until they were miles away, the farm little more than a memory behind them. Finally, he pulled the truck into a thicket of trees and killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. He and Ruthie scrambled to the back, yanking the tarp aside. Callie lay curled among the crates, bruised but alive. Tears streamed down her face, but her smile broke through the grime like a sunrise. "You did it," she whispered. Shaq's heart pounded in his ears. The price had been high. Betrayal, fear, the loss of trust in one of their own, but they had bought another day of freedom. He helped Callie down, steadying her on her feet. Ruthie wiped her forehead with her sleeve, her grin fierce. "That was one hell of a show, big man." Shaq chuckled, a sound of relief so deep it bordered on a prayer. They weren't safe. Not yet. The Harrows would regroup. They would come again, harder, meaner, more determined. But for now they had won. For now, Callie still had her life. Shaq looked out over the waking land, the fields golden and infinite. Freedom was never free, but it was worth every heartbeat they had spent buying it. The morning sun stretched long fingers over the patchwork fields, turning the dust into a golden mist. Hardwell Farms, usually forgotten by the world, stood trembling at the center of a brewing storm. Shaq stood near the weather-beaten porch, the wood groaning under his massive frame, scanning the line of battered trucks and sun-faded sedans, now filling the dirt lot like witnesses called to an unplanned trial. This wasn't how justice was supposed to happen, but maybe justice had finally gotten tired of waiting in the courthouse halls and decided to walk barefoot down the dirt roads instead. Word had spread faster than fire in dry brush. A famous man was sheltering a fugitive from powerful hands, and those hands were dirty with more than just greed. The farm hands, townsfolk, even a few old souls who'd spent their lives getting out of rich folks' way. They were here now, milling in the dirt, ready for something they couldn't quite name. Ready, perhaps, for the world to change, if only for a breath. He looked over at Callie, standing in borrowed clothes, her back straight despite the exhaustion lining her face. Her hands were empty, but she carried something heavier than a weapon. Truth. In the crowd, Ruthie caught his eye and nodded once. Their silent army, invisible no more. Across the lot, a black and white sheriff's car pulled up, its tires kicking up a grimy cloud. Sheriff Dalton stepped out, adjusting his belt over a stomach that had long since surrendered to time. His mirrored sunglasses hid his eyes, but Shaq knew the look would be one of suspicion edged with fear. The Harrows had lined the Dalton family's pockets for decades. Today, Dalton had to decide which side of history he wanted his name scratched into. Dalton swaggered toward them, trying to hold on to authority that had never really been his to begin with. "You called this circus, O'Neill," he barked, eyeing the crowd like they were an infestation. Shaq nodded slowly, holding the folder in plain view. "Got evidence. Got witnesses. Got a story that deserves more than a hush and a shove back under the rug." Dalton's mouth twisted. "In how we handle things round here." Shaq's voice dropped, calm and heavy as a falling stone. "Maybe that's why things are so broken." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Shaq could feel the energy shifting, people inching closer, standing a little straighter. Years of being told they were less than were unraveling right here in the dust and sunlight. Dalton hesitated. Shaq stepped forward, towering over him. "You can listen now," Shaq said, "or you can explain to every news station from here to Washington why you let a cartel of racist criminals walk free." The word cartel landed like a slap. Heads turned. Whispers buzzed like angry bees. Dalton jerked his chin toward one of his deputies. "Get the recorder," he barked. "If we're doing this, we're doing it official." It wasn't a courthouse. There were no suits, no polished pews, just a cracked wooden porch, a folding table dragged from somebody's barn, and the hard faces of people who had spent their lives being overlooked. Shaq didn't need marble columns. He needed the truth to echo loud enough to shatter the lies. Callie stepped forward first, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. She told them everything about the forced marriage, the threats, the night she ran from a life shaped like a cage. She named names. She didn't flinch when she spoke of her own father, her own blood, trying to erase her existence to protect his empire. Shaq watched the sheriff's mask crack, just a hairline fracture. But it was enough. He knew it then. This wasn't a man of principle but a man who recognized when the tides were turning too strong to fight. One by one, others stood. Ruthie spoke of lost relatives, pushed off their land when they couldn't pay sudden, unexplained debts. An old man named Hector told how his daughter had married into a family connected to the Harrows and disappeared 6 months later without a trace. Each voice was a hammer blow. Each testimony stripped another layer off the shiny surface the Harrows had built over decades of rot. Dalton shifted on his feet, sweat blooming under his arms, despite the mild day. His deputy scribbled furiously, head down. Finally, Shaq held up the folder. "This ledger," he said, his voice carrying like thunder, "proves everything. Paper trails all there. Names you know, names you don't." He opened it, flipping through page after damning page. Dalton hesitated. He glanced at the crowd. Then he reached for the folder with a hand that shook just slightly. The weight of the moment settled heavy over them all. "We'll investigate," Dalton said grudgingly. The pressure in the crowd swelled. It wasn't just Shaq anymore. It was all of them. Ordinary people. Invisible lives. Finally refusing to stay silent. Dalton's eyes darted toward the sheriff's car where the radio crackled. His shoulders slumped, not from shame, but from defeat. "Fine," he snapped. "We'll bring him in. Start with the Harrow boy, then the old man." Shaq turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the Harrow estate sat like a cancer on the land. It wasn't over. It wouldn't be easy. Powerful men didn't go quietly. But today, here in the dust and the heat, a truth had been spoken that couldn't be unsaid. Dalton returned, a clipboard in hand. "You'll need to give statements," he said gruffly. Shaq just nodded. He wasn't afraid of their paperwork. He wasn't afraid of the fight that would follow. He had faced bigger giants. He had been a bigger giant. As the crowd began to break apart, people lingering in clusters to murmur and wonder and hope, Callie came to stand beside him. "You didn't have to do all this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Shaq smiled. Not the big public grin of commercials and cameras, but something smaller. Something real. "Yeah," he said, "I did." Because sometimes the fight wasn't about winning. Sometimes it was about standing up, even when your legs shook. Sometimes it was about giving others permission to believe they could stand too. In the distance, the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the dirt lot, the fields, the lives that had changed forever. And somewhere deep in the earth, Shaq liked to imagine the seeds of something better finally beginning to take root. The court of dirt roads had spoken, and for once, justice had listened. The winds that once carried dust and despair across Hardwell Farms now carried something sweeter, the sharp scent of tilled earth, the bright promise of newly sown seeds, and the low hum of life reborn drifted through the fields. The cracked dirt paths, once beaten down by footsteps heavy with defeat, had sprouted green shoots of possibility. It had been 6 months since the day justice arrived, not in courtrooms or headlines, but in a gathering of weathered hands and stubborn hearts. 6 months since a runaway bride and a towering giant challenged a system built on fear and cracked its foundation wide open. The farm had changed, though no banners waved and no new signs hung above the old Nolan property. The changes weren't cosmetic, they were bone deep. Where once only laborers bent under silent suffering, now laughter floated across the fields. Men and women who had been ignored by the world found themselves planting more than crops. They were planting futures. Callie moved through the rows of fresh sprouts with sure-footed grace, clipboard in hand, sun-bleached hair tucked under a worn baseball cap. She spoke easily with the workers, listening more than she commanded, offering a hand when someone stumbled, sharing jokes and plans with equal measure. She wore no crown, but to those who worked the land, she was a queen of a kingdom built on resilience. The ledger had not only unseated the Harrows but shaken loose a network of corruption, so vast that even federal agents had been stunned by its reach. Trials still loomed for many of the guilty, but the community had moved faster than the courts. They didn't wait for permission to reclaim their dignity. A cooperative had been formed, worker-owned, worker-run. Land once hoarded by a handful of names was being sold off in parcels, and for the first time in generations, families who had toiled without hope were laying claim to something better. Callie was the face of it, but the heart was something bigger than any one person. It was Ruthie, teaching kids to tend gardens that would feed more than stomachs. It was Hector, repairing battered irrigation lines with hands that once had only known law. It was even Doyle, the farmhand who had betrayed them out of fear, now working double shifts to make amends, carrying his guilt like a yoke he refused to set down. Shaq watched from the edge of the fields, arms crossed loosely over his broad chest, a small, private smile touching his lips. He didn't step into the spotlight. He didn't stand on stages or give speeches. His name wasn't on the cooperative's paperwork, though the seed money that had kept it afloat after the dust settled had quietly come from his own accounts. He didn't need thanks. Watching the fields blossom was thanks enough. He turned away from the thriving farm, making his way back toward his truck parked under the same old oak tree where it had all begun. The breeze stirred the leaves above him, a soft rustling applause only he could hear. He paused at the door, looking back one last time. Callie spotted him from across the field. She jogged over, her boots kicking up small puffs of dry earth, her smile radiant and real. "You're leaving," she said, not a question but a knowing. Shaq chuckled, the sound low and warm. "You don't need me here anymore." Her smile faltered for just a heartbeat. The girl she once was flashing across her face before the woman she had become stood tall again. "Maybe not," she said, voice steady. "But that doesn't mean we'll forget." Shaq shrugged, the gesture easy, almost playful. "Forget me. Remember what you built." Callie's eyes shimmered, but she blinked the tears away. She held out a hand, and Shaq took it, his massive palm engulfing hers. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking just a little. Shaq squeezed her hand gently, then released it. "I will," she promised. He climbed into the truck, the old engine coughing awake under his touch. As he pulled onto the dirt road, Callie stood watching, growing smaller in the rearview mirror but larger in the world she had claimed with blood, sweat, and tears. The road stretched out ahead, golden under the afternoon sun, flanked by endless fields whispering with the wind. Shaq drove with the window down, the air carrying the sweet scent of growth and second chances. Shaq thought about the first time he'd seen Callie at that bus stop, a crumpled figure in a stained wedding dress, and marveled at the distance she had traveled. Not in miles but in spirit. He thought about Jed Nolan, whose betrayal had nearly cost them everything but who, in his final act, had shown that even broken men could choose the light. He thought about Ruthie, and Hector, and all the others who had risen when the world had told them to stay down. Shaq smiled to himself as the horizon swallowed the road ahead. He didn't know where he was headed next, but he knew what he carried with him. The knowledge that giants weren't made by wealth or applause. They were made by the moments no one saw, the ones where you chose to stand when it would have been easier to walk away. The sun dipped lower, painting the world in hues of fire and hope. And Big Shaq, the giant who had once been just a boy chasing a ball across cracked concrete, drove on into the new harvest, knowing he had finally found the measure of a real life. Not in trophies, not in headlines, but in the seeds he had helped plant, and the future he had dared to believe in. The dirt road curled ahead, endless and wide, and Shaquille O'Neal drove toward it with a heart full of love and a soul finally at peace. Because sometimes, planting hope was the biggest slam dunk of all.